All right, good morning. This is ComG 302, Research Methods, Special Topics on Research Ethics. This is Module 12 on Misconduct in Data Analysis and Reporting. So this is actually a follow-up with our topic yesterday, which was on the replicability crisis in social science, in particular in social psychology. As I said, the reason we want to talk about that topic and all the dark side in conducting social science is because, first of all, there are problems right now making the field under some kind of challenge. Second, the only way to solve any problem is to confront the problem and from there to think about possible solutions. So yesterday we said that at least one reason that many findings cannot be replicated resulting in the crisis is because there are some practices that researchers adopted in their process of doing research are questionable, to say the very least. So to understand, this issue deeper, then we need to understand. Okay, so what is the nature of these questionable research practices, QRPs, and how do we identify them, and what are some solutions? Essentially, then, in a very at a very general level, QRPs are, if you can think of it, as the steroids of scientific competition. All major competition, sports competitions in the world or at any level, forbid the use of steroids for very simple reasons. Steroids, among other illegal methods of boosting performance, will make the competition essentially unfair. The same thing goes on here if we allow QRPs to become more and more prevalent, because all those QRPs would make some researchers perform much better than researchers who are actually playing by the book. Again, if you recall, we discussed two examples or two studies where we see how easy it is to produce findings that are statistically significant, that is publishable in many good journals, yet the findings are either implausible or totally impossible, right? So if one researcher adopts subpar methods and produce findings that are published in good journals, whereas another researcher, he or she plays by the rules, use very rigorous methods, using much larger sample size and applying all the complicated statistical tools, and yet produce a finding that those good journals do not think interesting. So you can see that the competition then will also become very unfair, resulting in all kinds of problems that will eventually lead to the disappearance or lack of trust in that field, right? Which is that this is not a good thing, something we don't want to see. As we said, then to understand the whole issue, as students and even practitioners of social science, we need to identify some of the QRPs and to even estimate their prevalence, so that we can know the enemy, quote unquote, and then we can devise plans to eliminate or at least confront those enemies, in this case those questionable practices. So in the following slides, I'm gonna give you some examples of the QRPs. I mean, there are many of them now in the field, but some are rather technical. That means we're not in a position to really understand those QRPs unless we have rather advanced knowledge in statistics. But some QRPs, the ones that we are going to talk about in the next slides, I think are rather intuitive and easy to understand. So let's take a look. The first one is failing or choose not to report all dependent or outcome measures that a researcher includes in his or her study. So for example, again, let's use the study on the effect of listening to Hot Potato on feeling old, the study that we discussed yesterday. So, from previous classes, we can easily identify in this experiment the independent variable, which will be listening to a particular type of music, and the dependent variable, which is how old do you feel. And this dependent variable is the one that was reported. So imagine, and this I think is easy to imagine, that in a study on this particular effect, it's very easy for a researcher to include several additional dependent variables, right? For example, how happy do you feel after listening to Hot Potato or Kalimba, the control song? How young do you feel, in addition to how old do you feel? And how, for example, naive do you feel? How sophisticated do you feel? Etc., etc. Because, these are simply questions, and questions are easy to be included in a questionnaire, which we saw in our previous classes too. Right, so okay, so then you might ask, then what's the problem? Isn't it good to include as many questions as possible so that that study will give us more information? That's totally true. There's nothing wrong inherently in including multiple questions. Sometimes it is even desirable to include multiple questions because you're right, including multiple questions does provide more information, and that makes your study valuable. However, it will be a problem if you selectively report your dependent variables. For example, maybe the reason that we saw a paper on the effect of listening to Hot Potato on feeling old is because among all these dependent variables that you included in your questionnaire, in your experiment, only this one worked. And you discarded all the other dependent variables because they did not work, and you did not report them as if you never asked them, as if you never included them in your questionnaire. And that is a problem. So let me repeat. It's not a problem to include many dependent variables. It is, however, a problem that you selectively report some dependent variable while omitting other dependent variables. And this because, well, again, we can't get into the technical aspects of it. It has something to do with probabilities, but the conceptual idea is that including more dependent variables or outcome variables in a survey study will increase the chance of the researcher detecting results that are positive or that are significant, but in fact effects that do not exist. So again, in simple words, including more questions give you a larger chance of detecting false positives. Again, you can think of this as conducting medical tests in a sense. That is, the more tests you do, the bigger chance that you encounter one positive results. You think that's bad, but turns out that it's just luck. That's just how probability works. And of course, and if well, not you, but a researcher includes multiple DVs or outcome measures in their study and selectively, so that will provide the researcher with a chance of reporting whatever that is working, right? So that is problematic, because if the finding that has worked is purely due to chance or false positive, then the chance of replicating it in a independent study is going to be small. and that will result in the replicability crisis that we discussed in yesterday's module. Okay, so this is a problem. One, QRP, questionable research practice. A second QRP is to collect more data after seeing whether results were significant. What does it mean? It means, for example, in any study that you're interested in conducting, you make the start, and then you collected 20 subjects, let's say by the end of the third week, and say, well, let's take a look and see whether or not this result looks promising. And if it is promising, then I'll continue. If it does not seem to produce anything at all, then I'll stop and start over, making some modification to the idea, to the procedure, to the design, and I will start over. So this sounds actually a rather logical thing to do, right? So, why keep doing things if this thing is not working? This, however, is a problem. The problem or the consequence of this practice, that is analyzing data when you're collecting data, is another rather effective method to increase false positive rates. And this is because I think we mentioned it briefly in our previous module. Small sample sizes, 10, 20, 15, even 30 sometimes, are very easy to produce extreme values, and extreme values will result in results that seems rather significant, resulting in false positives. So that's why we said that it's wrong to look at the data while you're collecting data. So what's the correct alternative? There are many ways to correct this problem, but the best practice is you predetermine a sample size. That is, you say, well, for this study, based on previous research, based on my calculation, I need 100 people, at least. And then you actually announce it somewhere. Now there's some very good websites actually created and maintained by social scientists purely for the purpose of registering your study. So you go to that website and then you type in your name and type in the title of your project, and then you make a statement on the website under your name and under the name of the project that for this project my target sample size is 100 people with 50 males and 50 females. So that the next step is you will only analyze your data when you reach that sample size, and you don't take a look while you are collecting your data. So that's the honest way to do things, and that's the best practice to do things. Because that will reduce the false positive rates instead of increasing it. The third example QRP is to not report odd conditions, and this is specific to experiments. Again, let's make things more concrete. For example, you're interested in the effect of listening to hot potato on feeling old, and we know from yesterday's module that there are two conditions. In one condition, participants listen to kalimba, and a second condition, a different group of participants listen to hot potato. But it is entirely possible that in the real experiment, in fact, there was a third condition where a third group of participants, listened to the song yesterday. But because, for example, results in this particular condition does not look pretty, it didn't work. It even produced some counterproductive results. They said, well, let's then not report it, as if it did not happen, as if it did not exist at all. So this is very similar to the previous, well, one of the previous QRPs we talked about, that is selectively reporting dependent measures. So again, the more condition you use, the more likely you're going to detect some significant results, but in fact, those results are simply false positives. So you can see many of these QRPs, they're problematic exactly because they produce false, well, they increase false positive rates, right? It's not possible to completely eliminate false positives, but it is our job as students and practitioners of social science to reduce and control false positive rates. And only by doing that can we at least alleviate the replicability crisis. The next QRP, questionable research practice, is again selectively reporting. And this time, instead of selectively reporting your dependent or outcome measures or your conditions, this is selectively reporting studies that worked. And this practice is also known as the file drawer problem. And why is it called that? Well, it's very easy to imagine or understand this. For example, again, you're interested in the effect of listening to Hot Potato on feeling old, but you conducted the first study, it didn't work. And then you conduct the next study, and it also did not work. And perhaps, finally you found an effect when you conducted the ninth or the 10th study. It finally worked. Then you are very happy. You say, oh, now I got a significant finding. I can publish this one study in a good journal. And you did. You succeeded in doing that. But what's the problem? If you conducted 10 studies on a particular effect and only one worked, then what's the chance of this effect is true? Right? So, you reported that one study that worked, creating an impression that the study worked the first time that you tried it. And that painted a very different picture than you telling people that I conducted 10 studies and only one worked, right? That would suggest a very different conclusion. So you published one study that seems to be the reality, whereas the reality or the truth simply, or more likely, lies with the 9 unreported studies that did not work. So again, if you selectively report studies that worked, you again will be inflating false positive rates, and that's not good. Alright, so we have talked about then several examples of questionable research practices. As we said, there are many, and it really will go beyond the scope of this class to go through each one of them because some of them are rather technical. But once we have a sort of intuitive understanding of at least some of those questionable research practices, we can then turn our attention to how prevalent their prevalence in research community. So researchers actually did a deceptively simple study to estimate the prevalence of questionable research practices among psychologists, a field that's very closely related to communication. So instead, in this study, or in that study, the group of researchers simply send an email questionnaire to all the researchers listed in major research universities in this country and asked them, okay, so how often, for example, you fail to report all the dependent measures in your study? How often you collected more data after seeing whether results were significant or not? How often you failed to report all the conditions? How often you selectively report studies that worked? Well, so in addition to that self-report question, The researchers conducting the study also asked the participants, in this case, the participants are professors, researchers in all those major universities in this country. So the second question those participants received is, how prevalent do you think? That is, how many other researchers in this country that you think have practiced each of these QRPs? Okay, so this will be the second bar. So the black bar represents their self-emission rate. The second bar represents the participants' estimation of the prevalence of each of these QRPs. And the third bar is a estimate of the prevalence based on these two numbers reported using some fancy statistic techniques. Anyway, so this bar represents supposedly an estimate of the true prevalence of the practices, each of the practices in the field, because this one is based on self-report. And people do lie when they self-report, especially when they're reporting something that's not very glorious. The second number is there is participants' guess of how prevalent those practices are in the field. Again, this kind of guess is not very accurate. I mean, we're not saying that those researchers will lie, but people are simply not good at guessing things. But somehow, based on the self-emission rate and based on this estimated or self-report prevalence, we can calculate a number that represents, well, supposedly will estimate the true prevalence rate of each of these QRPs in the field. Okay, so for example, regarding this QRP failing to report all dependent measures, about 78% of the researchers surveyed reported that they have done such a thing. And they estimate that, no, sorry, not 78, but close to 70% of the researchers surveyed reported that they had actually failed at least once to report all dependent measures. And they estimated that about slightly over 60% of other researchers would do the same thing. And then, but based on these two numbers, the actual prevalence might be 100%. That is, it is very likely that all researchers in those major research universities have committed this particular questionable research practice, and the overall mean, right, the average of these three numbers is about 78%. Okay, so you read the bars for other QRPs similarly, right? For example, close to 60% of researchers in those major research universities admitted that they have collected more data after seeing whether the results are significant. They estimated, slightly over 60% of others have done that, but the likely true prevalence rate for this particular QRP is virtually all researchers have done that. And then you move along the continuum to look at each of the QRPs all the way to this last column here, which is falsifying data. That is essentially making up data, right? This result is also some sort of interesting. That is, how much, or the extent to which those surveyed researchers suspect others and themselves have committed some of those QRPs. Only 10% of the surveyed respondents suspected researchers at other institutions. They somehow suspected researchers at other institutions to committed various categories of questionable research practices. They're less suspicious of researchers at their own institution. They're somewhat suspicious of their graduate students. They're not very suspicious of their collaborators, and they're not very suspicious of themselves, for sure. Now, before we close this module, I would like to mention two extreme examples of committing questionable research practices. And these two examples represents two entirely different scenarios. The first one is a former Professor Staple. Um, Former Professor Staple was working at a major university at the Netherlands, and he had been a very famous social psychologist. But one day, there's a whistleblower somehow, and then it was found out that this former Professor Stable has some serious issues with his publications. And after a long investigation, he admitted at last that he had intentionally fabricated data over a dozen years, that is, making up data. In other words, he claimed that he had done some studies, but he never did those studies. Instead, he just made up his data for those studies, and resulting in retracting over 50 publications. Right, 50. That is, he made up data for over 50 papers, and each paper contained an average of 3 to 4 studies, and you can do the calculation. That's making up data for over 120 studies over a dozen years, and that's a serious breach of code of research ethics. And of course, there are various consequences to former Professor Stable. If you're interested, you can Google him and you can get a full picture of this incident. But anyway, so the solution to this kind of purposeful breach of research ethics is to reinforce research ethics at various levels, at the level of the discipline, at the level of the institution, and of course reinforce the idea of ethically conducting research at researchers' level. The second example is rather interesting. The second example is a study, a series of study on the demonstration of extrasensory perception. In other words, Dr. Bem conducted a series of studies showing that people do have the ability to foresee the future. That's a rather implausible result given our current understanding of physics, right? That is, Bem suggested, in other words, we do, and we have the ability to predict what's going to happen next with an accuracy rate above 50%. So that's implausible. Somehow, though, Dr. Bem's study was published in a very prestigious journal in social psychology, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The results of that study is so controversial that editors have to publish a note confirming that the paper of Dr. Bem actually conformed to all the scientific standards. So this is a conundrum. On one hand, this person found effects that could not have existed, predicting the future. On the other hand, editors and reviewers do agree that there's nothing wrong to the studies in terms of procedure and methodology. In other words, Dr. Bem did not fabricate data. Those data are true. Those data are genuine. He did conducted all those studies reported in the paper. In fact, I once listened to the talk of Dr. Bem while I was still in California. So the solution, though, to this problem is, well, I should also add that when other researchers try to replicate Dr. Bem's study, they did not get to replicate the results. So this incident is very different from the previous incident. In example one, former Professor Staple, he fabricated data, and of course that's wrong. In this case, Dr. Bem did not fabricate data, and he conformed to all the standards of scientific behavior, similar to the case of the Stanford prison study, right? Zimbardo conformed to all the ethical requirements at that time. But that does not mean that his study is ethical. So similarly here, Dr. Ben conformed to all the scientific standards back then in 2011, but that does not mean that all the scientific standards back then are good and perfect. So the solution to this kind of study that to the study where researchers did not do anything wrong, but somehow found effects that are implausible and yet have those effects published in good journals, is to as a field we should raise the bar of scientific standards so that we can weed out findings that are simply not possible. Okay. All right. So this is a module on the topic on questionable research practices. It's a follow-up from the previous lecture on the dark side of doing social science. Okay, so I hope these two modules are enlightening but not discouraging for students and practitioners of social sciences, because these are problems that do exist and these are problems that we need to solve. All right, see you next time.